All right, we have been discussing the five-factor model, and so I want to jump in and actually go through the five in some detail. So I'll be taking at least a day on each of these five traits, and I'm going to begin at the beginning with the first trait, extraversion, which generally involves being outgoing and experiencing positive emotions. That's kind of the core of this, but as we'll see going through this, it's debatable as to what the core is. As you know already, there are number of facets with each of these traits, six facets, and there's debate among researchers as to, in the case of extroversion, what is the core of this disorder. Historically, I think most people, if you would ask most people, whether psychologists or non-psychologists, most people would assume that the core of this trait is sociability, which is the outgoing part of what you see here. That's what most people kind of identify this trait as being. But as we'll see, there's actually the actual data kind of draws this into question. So, but nevertheless, we can say that that's certainly a component of it. I mean, behaviorally, if you look at these people, the most striking thing about them is their outgoing nature. This has emerged as one of the fundamental dimensions of personality in nearly every model. Again, there's a lot of debate, I guess we could say, from one theorist to another about all five of these dimensions. But the one thing that virtually everyone, well, really everyone that I know of, I don't know of any exceptions, everyone, all the theorists agree that this trait is important. It's included in every model, which is not the case with many of the others. For example, we saw Eysenck only had two of the big five traits in his model. He had extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, which is not part of the big five. Every model has extroversion. And by the way, when I say extroversion, I mean extroversion and introversion. It's a single continuum. Remember that. It's very important. This is a trait theory, not a type theory. So extroversion and introversion are the same dimension. They're opposite ends of the same dimension. But extroversion is the most common name for the trait. We could theoretically just call it introversion, but extroversion is the trait, because in some ways we can kind of think as introversion is sort of a lack of extroversion. Again, extroversion, I mean, when we look at this trait, thing that's, striking is the presence of these outgoing traits. It's harder to think in terms of a negative, which is what introversion is. It's sort of the absence of all of these traits that we associate with the extrovert. So that's, we tend to just think of it in terms of extroversion, but it is a single dimension, and it is included in every model. It accounts for the largest percentage of variance in terms of personality. Now, this trait is actually been recognized for thousands of years. Human beings have, vary in this trait. I guess they've always varied in it. We actually see these kinds of some of these kinds of differences in animals as well. So my guess is human beings have always differed in extroversion, and it's been mentioned, at least going back as far as a couple of thousand years or 1500 years. But Carl Jung is actually credited with popularizing the term in the modern era. And you remember, or many of you may know, Carl Jung was actually a colleague, contemporary of Freud's. He was a psychoanalyst, as was Freud. Now, according to Jung, the difference. Now, again, Jung viewed these. His theory was a type theory, so he viewed them as being totally different types of individuals, but they were sort of opposites of one another. But he didn't view it as a continuum, but he viewed he believed that introverts were people who were focused inwardly, whereas extroverts were focused outwardly. So the introvert is sort of consumed with their own thoughts and feelings and fantasies, whereas the extrovert is focused outwardly on other people, on things outside of themselves. This is no longer the way we view personality today. So even though our extroversion, rather, so even though Jung is credited with that term, and we still use the term, we don't think about it the same way. And so this illustrates really from the beginning, the different theorists think about it differently. So, and I've alluded to that, and I'll touch on throughout the lecture some of the differences. There's a lot they have in common, but there are differences. And again, Jung's idea of being inwardly focused versus outwardly focused is not consistent with any of the contemporary theorizing about this trait. Now, the facets, I'm going to go through each of the facets and comment about this. And by the way, we see here pictured Jimmy Fallon, who is, I can't think of anyone, the textbook uses him as an example. Well, actually, they mentioned several people, but I think he's the best example mentioned, and which is probably why they chose to use his photo. I couldn't think of a better example of an extrovert as far as celebrities go. So what are the traits of extroverts? They're friendly. These, you would call them, or they would probably describe themselves as a people person. They like people. They like talking to people. They like, being around people. They engage in more affiliative kinds of behaviors. They also are what we would call party people. So they don't just like people, they like lots of people. And they like environments where they like parties, simply put. They like the energy, they like the socializing aspect, the stimulation. They like everything about parties, and including the drinking too. But they don't like being alone, which you can gather from these first 2 points. These are not people who enjoy quiet time alone. They want to be in the presence of other people, and they tend to be uncomfortable when they are not in the presence of other people. They want to go out and do things. Not only do they like being at the party, they are usually the life of the party. And so, in addition to being friendly and gregarious, they are assertive. They tend to be socially, not just socially outgoing, but socially dominant. These are the people who are dancing on the table. They're telling jokes. In fact, that's a pretty good indication that someone is an extrovert. They love to tell jokes. So people are drawn to them, and they tend to be the center of attention. So again, we can already see Jimmy Fallon's like in the perfect, job. He gets to talk to new people for a living, which is, if you're an extrovert, that's like the perfect job. Activity level. People who are high in extraversion are energetic. They're vigorous. There's a certain intensity about them. They tend to move fairly quickly. They swing their arms more when they walk. They just have a lot of energy. Very vigorous individuals. They are also excitement seeking or stimulation seeking. They are drawn to adrenaline. They like, as I mentioned, they like alcohol and other substances. They like, really anything that's exciting. They're fairly easily bored. Some theorists have emphasized this more than others. Eysenck, for example, really emphasized their tendency to become bored. They need to be doing something pretty much all the time. So, which again is somewhat connected to the activity level, so they're not just people who enjoy being at a party and being life of the party. They're at parties all the time. So, it's not like they just go to parties once in a while. They have a high activity level. They're high sensation seeking. So they're always doing something. They don't really like downtime. So there's always something on horizon, and it's something high energy. It's something stimulating. These are people who are going to spring break and jumping off of cliffs and bungee jumping and dancing and the loud music. They need stimulation. And by the way, we'll talk about this more when we get to the section on biology, but they literally need stimulation. Their brains, compared to introverts, really need a lot of stimulation. Finally, cheerfulness. This it turns out, is actually a very important part, and it doesn't get nearly as much attention from the general popular press as, again, the outgoing part of this. But experiencing positive emotions is very important part of this trait. Arguably just as important as the sociability. And it's just pretty evident. We see and I'll talk about more about this in a second, but because it is so important. But you can see it just like in this photo. Their extroverts are almost always smiling. They're cheerful, happy, people. So, with no further ado, positive affect. This is something that has been demonstrated in many studies around the world, many cultures. The average correlation between positive affect and extroversion is 0.4, which is a pretty good size correlation. Extroverts, compared to introverts, extroverts are happier, pretty much any way you slice it. Whether you're talking about general levels of happiness or at any particular time frame, moment to moment, whether they're doing something or not doing something. I mean, even when extroverts love people, but even when they're alone, they're happier than introverts. They are just generally happy people compared to introverts. And this is likely one of the reasons why they have better mental health than introverts. Extroverts are much less likely to suffer from pretty much well, I shouldn't say that, but a lot of psychological disorders, depression, for example, obviously, but personality disorders, a number of disorders. Extroverts fare much better than introverts do. And at least part of that may be due to the fact that they have more relationships. And so the quality and quantity of relationships, especially quality of relationships, matters. Although extroverts don't necessarily, I'm not sure that extroverts really have better relationships. They have more relationships. They don't necessarily have better relationships because some of their relationships are superficial, but people like them, and that's the thing. When people like you, you tend to be happier. In fact, even I guess if you don't like them, but if they like you, and people do tend to like extroverts more than introverts, and I hate to say that for those of you who are introverts. But the research is pretty clear that in terms of social desirability, extroversion is viewed more positively than introversion is. And there are a lot of social benefits associated with being extroverted. So anyway, that's part of the reason, but it's probably more than that. But so we see the huge differences in positive affect. In fact, the theorist that has emphasized this the most is probably Ook Tulligan from the University of Minnesota, who argues that positive emotionality is actually the core of this trait. I mentioned earlier that most people tend to think that sociability is at the core of this trait. Tulligan challenges that, and in his model, there are 4 facets. Well-being, which corresponds to cheerfulness. Social potency, which corresponds to assertiveness. Social closeness, which is friendliness or warmth, and achievement. And what he found is that these are all correlated with each other. However, the correlation between them is disappears when you control for positive affect. In other words, positive affect is which is the cheerfulness, he called it well-being, that is correlated with the other three. They're all four correlate with each other, but the correlations between the other three drop to basically zero when you pull out the well-being factor or facet. And so that suggests that positive affect, which of course is the well-being cheerfulness facet, is at the heart of this trait. Because once we remove positive affect, the components of extraversion, the other facets of extraversion, do not correlate with each other. Basically, it falls apart. The entire factor falls apart if we pull out the positive affect part of it. Based on this, Tulligan suggested that we should actually rename extraversion positive emotionality, because in his mind, that's really what it is. This is the core of the trait, is positive emotionality. Now, there are some problems with this. For example, the shared variance between positive emotionality and extroversion is only about 30%, so that suggests clearly there's more to it than just positive emotionality. And there are other theorists who have found that the sociability to be the core component that kind of holds things together. So this never really caught on. The Tulligan's argument has not really, you can see this goes back to the 80s. And as for now, the trait is still most commonly referred to as extraversion. But again, there's regardless of what is the core trait, clearly positive affect is a very, very important part of this trait. And there are many, I mean, I'm limited here. In fact, I'm almost out of time for today, but in terms of how much deeply I can get into this, but just a couple of little nuggets for you that are kind of interesting. Extroverts judge neutral events more positively than introverts. So this tells us that there's kind of a pervasive glass is half full outlook that extroverts have. The glass is and this is what I guess what we would expect with positive affect. That's kind of what we would expect. And interestingly, the opposite, and I actually found this in my own research, the opposite is true of those high in neuroticism. And neuroticism is the negative affect trait. Extroversion is and by the way, that's an important point I should mention. Introversion, as odd as it sounds, positive affect and negative affect, because we've been talking about dimensions, positive affect and negative affect are not the same dimension in terms of measuring the way human beings respond. Those are not, I mean, conceptually they may seem like opposites, but in terms of the human brain, they're not. And so if we look at the 5 factors, the extraversion trait is the one that is predictive of positive affect, and neuroticism is predictive of negative affect. And what we see the exact same thing. Extroverts will judge neutral events more positively than introverts. And in my research, I found those high neuroticism judge neutral situations more negatively than did introvert or extroverts. In that study, and I'll probably mention it again when we get to neuroticism or at some point in the semester, but they were given either positive, negative, or neutral feedback about themselves. And, everyone recognized the negative feedback as negative and the positive feedback as positive. But the neutral feedback was interpreted negatively by those high in neuroticism and positively by those low in neuroticism. So that's just kind of an interesting pattern that we see. Another interesting finding with extraversion, extraversion predicts categorization of words by their positive affective quality rather than their semantic quality. And so extroverts are more likely to judge the words hug and smile as more similar than the words smile and face, which is interesting because smile and face semantically are more closely related. I mean, where do you find a smile on someone's face? Clearly, they're strongly overlapping categories, but emotionally, smile and hug are closely related because both of them suggest happiness and affection, and that's where extroverts' minds are. They really think in terms of, I mean, that really illustrates the power of positive affect in the mind of an extrovert. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, just in the interest of time. I like to keep these under 30 minutes. So we will continue next time with extraversion.